Hello everyone, Morphy here. I'm here today with Dr. Clint Heacock from the Mindshift Podcast, a podcast which I have been binge listening to for the last week. It's very, very good. Given the topics we're likely to get onto today, perhaps I should greet you, Clint, with Blessed Day, or May the Lord Open.
Thank you, I'll take that.
I really love the podcast, and as I say, I've been binge listening to it for over a week, and I think in another week I'll have cleared the back catalogue. You've had an interesting life, as we'll get into. You've done lots and lots of things, growing up in Seattle as an evangelical Bible college, professor at a seminary, losing your faith, moving to Wales, starting Mindshift. But the first question I have for you is, have you ever thought of changing your name to Cliff?
I've been called a lot of things. Yeah, I understand there was a little bit of a mix-up with your last episode.
Yeah,
I think I got changed to Cliff.
I apologise. On the Eric Murphy episode, I did call you Cliff, and it wasn't
That's
the
true.
only mistake I made in that episode, so apologies.
We all make mistakes.
And the other mistake I made was that I am actually still a patron of Thomas Westbrook and Holy Kool-Aid, and I thought I'd only done that while he was living abroad, but I'm apparently still doing it because I watched his latest video today and my name was still there, not Atheist Morph, but my actual real name. So that was a good one. Alright, so we need to move to our list of questions. So if you're happy to talk about your education, growing up in Seattle and the education you had, that would be a good start.
Oh man, there's so much to talk about. But yeah, I grew up in a pretty much a fundamentalist church. Actually, it was the Church of Christ denomination just outside of Seattle, Washington. And in fact, I just wrote an article on Medium the other day talking about some of my experiences going back when I was a kid, right around 9 or 10. There was a lot of things that happened there where I was really convinced that I was going to get left behind in the rapture because we'd seen that movie, A Thief in the Night, and it was absolutely terrifying as a kid. So I got baptized, and I thought I was going to be a good Christian, and it didn't work out so well. So I ended up getting baptized again when I was 13, and then I got baptized again when I was about 25. So it just kept, trying and trying and trying. So I think a lot
What do you mean by it not working out so well?
Well, this is the funny thing is that as a kid, I really wanted to take it seriously. I did take it seriously. I was raised in the Christian environment. My parents were Christians. They were raising us kids according to Bill Gothard's teachings, which is a whole nother story. So it was really serious. I would say now I had developed a case of religious scrupulosity where I was obsessed with the idea that God was watching everything that I did, and I was constantly sinning and making mistakes, and I had to be careful that I wasn't going to get left behind in the rapture. I thought I might have lost my salvation. I thought I might have blown it. So if Jesus came back, I'd get left behind. So I was really like OCD almost as far as religion. I was super careful to make sure that I prayed the sinner's prayer every night just to make sure that I was going to be saved. And it was a tremendous amount of anxiety, really, because I was so obsessed with being, and that's why I thought it's not working. So I need to go back and get baptized again, just to make sure. All part of this religious scrupulosity, I think.
Okay. Did you go to a public school or were you homeschooled?
I was never homeschooled. Luckily, I went to a public school up till about year 4. And then I transferred to a very small Christian school in 5th grade. And then from there, I went all the way through to high school at a Christian school in Seattle. So that was my whole education, basically from year 5 on all the way through high school was at a Christian school.
And then you went on to a Bible college, is that right?
Yeah, I went down to Bible college in Portland, Oregon, did an undergraduate degree there, and we stayed on. I got involved in a church, and then at the same time I was going to seminary, so I did an MA there, and then I turned around and did a THM a couple of years later at the same seminary. So it was a conservative sort of Baptist seminary down there in Portland.
And is that where you ended up teaching?
No, I was a pastor of a church at the same time I was doing my MA and THM for about 12 years. And then from there, we came over here to the UK where I was doing my doctoral work. And then it was after that that I got a job at a Bible college located out of Birmingham in the UK. And I taught all over the place, mostly in Leeds and Liverpool, for about 7 or 8 years for them.
And you were teaching Bible studies, or?
Oh, I taught everything. I used to teach Old and New Testament, church ministry, leadership, uh, church planting, theology, all sorts. I taught all kinds of subjects for them.
That's interesting. Just
Hmm.
winding back a little bit to your childhood. On one of the podcasts, you mentioned that you came across this model of the family with Christ, the umbrellas.
Mm-hmm.
Christ,
That's Bill
husband,
Gothard.
wife. Bill Gothard. I couldn't come up with the
Mm-hmm.
name today.
Yep.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? How that worked out?
Well, you could say that Bill Gothard was a proponent of what's called biblical patriarchy. This is the model that as you said, the umbrellas. It's all based on what he called This is God's order for the family. Was that the husband? It's like a series of umbrellas, each getting smaller and smaller. So you got God, you got Christ, you got the church, you got the father, the wife, the children underneath that. And the really insidious part about the doctrine is that what Gothard taught was if at any point you removed yourself from underneath one of those umbrellas, no matter what scale you were at, you were then outside of God's protection and thus open to the attacks of Satan. And apparently God couldn't do anything about that because you had removed yourself from his sort of divine order for the way the world should operate.
Perhaps you've moved under the second set of umbrellas that I found that I sent to you. The one with
Yeah.
with Satan as the top umbrella, and then the wife.
I'm under
and then the
Satan's
husband.
umbrella, apparently. They would say that, yeah. But I can remember as a kid, and we did a podcast on this, me and my sister Valerie, a few years ago, where we talked about what it was like to grow up in a home where parents, taught us the principles of Gothard's teachings. And when she got pregnant at 17, my parents reacted very badly to that. And I can remember my mom sitting me down and telling me that the reason that your sister got pregnant and she's in all this trouble now is because she's removed herself from underneath the umbrella of our protection. And so that's how the whole thing was explained to me as a kid of, again, around that same age, 9 or 10, 11 years old. And that's how we interpreted it.
So Valerie's older than you are.
Yeah, she's
Yeah,
quite a
yeah.
bit. I shouldn't say quite a bit older. Now she's going to be upset. She's my older sister. I'll just leave it at that. One of my older
And
sisters.
it's the same sort of gap that there is between me and my sister. I've got a sister who's 9 years younger. So, yeah, I that didn't come across in the podcast. When I was listening to the podcast and you were talking about Valerie, I was wondering whether she was older or younger because,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know
Yeah, she's
where
older
you
than.
were. I didn't know where you were on the umbrella scale at that point.
Yeah, it's a weird dynamic because my family, I'm actually the youngest biological child. I'm the youngest of six. My parents had five sisters. I've got five sisters. They're all older than me. And then I'm the last one. But yet, weirdly, I'm the only boy. So they treated me more like the firstborn son. So if you look at like the family dynamics of birth order and things like that, my sister, who's just above me, she exhibits more the characteristics of the baby of the family because she's the last girl. It's very strange dynamic. So I don't have a lot of the baby of the family characteristics, weirdly enough.
So I get the impression that you're actually quite close with Valerie now.
Yeah,
Is
we
that
are.
true?
She's actually
Uh,
the only one left that I'm really in a relationship with. Unfortunately, my family has really broken down over the last 6 or 7 years.
but that's I'm sorry to hear that.
Hmm.
But your closeness with Valerie, is that something
Mm-hmm.
that's been re-established in your more recent times, or were you always close?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a period where probably about 4 or 5 years where we did not speak at all. And we came to find out that basically it was the sort of machinations of my mother, who was very manipulative. She had inserted a wedge in between myself and Valerie we used to be super close when I was kids. You know, we were really close. She taught me how to draw. She was my favorite sister, my big sister, and all that. And then when that whole thing went down, when she got pregnant at 17, it just tore the family right apart. And again, like I said, the way my parents handled it, they didn't handle it well. I can remember as a kid sitting in the living room, and my parents had all of us gathered around, and they would just scream at Valerie. You know, they'd have these huge fights. And so our closeness was kind of, you know, based on the fact that we came together around her in this issue of her being pregnant and having this kid. But then later, I think my mom was quite jealous of that closeness. And so she succeeded in driving us apart for a number of years. And it was only when we started comparing notes that we said, wait a minute, she told you that? Well, she told me this. And none of that's true. And that's when we've gotten back together and become really close again.
Yeah, reading between the lines, I think I could have almost prophesied that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had a feeling really that would be your answer.
Yeah, and come to find out, that was a pattern that my mom and both her mom and my great grandmother as well. This is something that they've been doing for decades, years, generations. That they are very good at driving wedges and destroying relationships that they're jealous of. So it's very dysfunctional, really.
So, what made you start doubting? You were teaching theology and Old and New Testament and all these sorts of things all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
What made you start to doubt?
It was a case of when I was still a pastor, I was having problems, and it was more related to, I guess, the pastoral burnout that I was experiencing. I was working probably 60 plus hours a week, every week, burning myself out, burning the candle at both ends. And that was exhausting. And I started reading some progressive Christians back then, guys like Rob Bell, Brian McLaren, Donald Miller. And this is about 15 years ago or so now, more than 15 years ago. And it really started getting me to question some of my own Christian beliefs at the time. And I can see now that it was a sort of the path, this progression out. You know, I didn't see it at the time, but I was jettisoning some of the things that I'd really thought I had to believe absolutely were true. And as I was reading guys like McLaren and Miller and some of the other things, I came to see that Christianity, or at least the Christianity I'd been living, was really a formulaic religion. And that led me on this path of sort of discovery for a long time. And I think going off to seminary and then doing a PhD, that was part of my aim. My effort was to help other people avoid some of the traps that I'd fallen into growing up. And I see, and in the end, it didn't work because I ended up getting out of the whole thing. But it was a long journey. Someone said it's like the death of 1,000 cuts, really. It was a long, slow process.
It's interesting you saying about the pastoral burnout. Mm-hmm. Listening to Seth Andrews, he has that experience in his life of pastors who work really, really hard. And I think a lot of us look at the, Kenneth Copeland's and Ted Haggard's and Joel Osteen's and people like that. But that's not your regular pastor on the ground. Your regular pastor on the ground is actually working really hard for not very much money.
Yeah, that's true. Most pastors are working really, really hard for, like you say, very little money. It's exhausting. It's tiring. It's a thankless job. It's one of the worst professions you can be a part of, just from a mental health perspective. Because in my case, for example, I either heard nothing or criticism of what I was trying to do. My sermons and all the work that I did, I was burning myself out, and people were still, they'd gossip about you. They'd talk about you behind your back, or they'd criticize you in church meetings. And, it's really discouraging. It really is. It's just it can be a very discouraging profession. And that you hear a lot of things about pastors who battle with depression and anxiety and, things like that because of that environment that they're in.
Yeah, that's rough. So when you were getting further out, were there any atheists that you followed in particular? Did you get into Hitch or any of that sort of stuff?
That's the funny thing is I didn't go down that line at all. It was more of a theological deconstruction for me. Like I said, going down this route of reading progressive authors and questioning my own belief system. And then when I was doing my PhD over here, my supervisor was really good. He would really gently kind of point out as I would submit these chapters in my doctoral work. He would say, "Are you sure you want to say that?" And I go, "What? What are you talking about?" Because I was doing a PhD, this dissertation on the book of Ezekiel, and because I was really an Old Testament scholar, that was my real field of study, and I was making some pretty dogmatic assertions in this in this thesis. And I'd say, "What?" And he would kind of pull me up on it. And it started me thinking, wait a minute, why am I saying that? Why am I saying that? Do I need to have that statement in this thing? And he would say, you could leave it in there, you have to be prepared to defend it, but I think you might want to look at that. And I started to realize, my God, I've been really quite, dogmatic and pretty fundamentalist when it comes to interpreting the Bible and the inerrancy of the Bible and all those kind of things that I was raised to believe were true. And that's when I was really thinking, I don't think I believe a lot of this anymore.
So, when you were doing your PhD at the seminary, did you have to sign any sort of statement of faith?
No, not here. It wasn't at a seminary. I did it at the University of Chester, it's technically a Church of England college, or university, but they're not dogmatic at all. Not like it is in the States. Now, when I went to Bible college, that was the case. I had to sign a statement of faith on basically day one, and as well, again, before you graduated, you had to go back and review your doctrinal position, make sure nothing has changed, and sign it again. So they wouldn't let you graduate without signing the doctrinal statement for a second time. That was at the Bible college.
Well, that's heavy.
Yeah, but
Just
that's par for the course though, because I had applied for several jobs in the States at seminaries and Bible colleges, and virtually every one of them required you as a lecturer to sign a statement of faith as well. So there you can see how they're trying to control the influx of both students and staff to make sure that they're on the same page doctrinally. So it's pretty common, I think, in the States, so certainly in conservative Bible colleges and seminaries.
yeah, I just wonder from a academic point of view, how do they think actual research is being done if you've got to work within these guidelines? I'm just
Yeah.
thinking to myself, let's say that I was, maths is my field. So if I was doing some sort of thesis where I was looking for a proof of the twin primes, I don't know if you know about twin primes, but we can prove, and it's been proved for a long time, that there's an infinite number of primes. But twin primes are primes that are two numbers apart, like 11 and 13 or 41 and 43. And it's not known, it's simply not known whether there's an infinite number of those. And somebody might prove me wrong, because that might have happened in the last month or two since I
30
last
seconds.
heard.
Right.
But as far as I'm aware, at this stage, there is no proof that there's an infinite number of twin primes. And let's say I was doing that research and I got a visit from, the NSA or MI5, since I'm British, and they said to me, whatever your findings, you have to say that there is an infinite number of twin primes, because all of our encryption is based on this.
Mm-hmm.
And if I found that it wasn't true, I wouldn't be allowed to publish. And that's, to me, that's the equivalent. It's the exact equivalent.
Exactly. Well, I can give you example after example of how that works and shakes out in daily practice, because when I was doing my MA thesis at seminary in Portland, I had written this. I was doing a study on the book of Obadiah, and I wrote a chapter and I submitted it to my second reader. And I have two readers in the seminary, and the guy who was the second reader was a classic fundamentalist, kind of like what you're describing, going down that real restricted route. And he did not like what I wrote in this chapter about the book of Obadiah, because it contradicted some of his own published works and the way he interpreted the Bible and so forth. And he literally screamed at me in his office. I mean, his head was going to explode, I thought. Veins were popping out of his neck. He told me that I was a disgrace to the seminary. I had no business being in ministry. I had no business being there as a student. I needed to, repent basically and see the light and all this. And I was sitting there just stunned. This guy, he'd been there teaching for over 20 years. Well respected, wrote many books, got a PhD in biblical studies, blah blah blah. I took that manuscript to my first reader and I said, I've just been screamed at by this guy. What am I supposed to do? And he said, you have to delete that whole chapter. We're not going to get the MA thesis signed if you don't delete that whole chapter. So I did. I had to. So exactly what you said. I mean, no matter what I had discovered, no matter what research and writing I had done, if it contradicted this guy's narrow interpretation, he wasn't going to sign off on it, and I wouldn't have gotten my degree. So I had to delete an entire chapter of my thesis. Unbelievable. From an academic point of view, that is unbelievable. And yet, there it is. That's what happened to me.
Just one last question on this section, Clint. And you don't have to answer this, and I can cut it off the tape if you don't want to. But as you were coming out, relationships, were you married at the time? Are you still married to the same woman? You know, what happened with all of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, still married to the same woman. Luckily for me, we both deconstructed kind of at the same time. In fact, we were both reading when I was reading Brian McLaren and Rob Bell and all those progressive Christians. She was sitting in bed next to me reading the other book that I was reading McLaren and she was reading Bell or Miller. And we'd say, wait, stop. You got to put that book down for a minute. You got to listen to this quote, so we were both questioning and deconstructing right around the same time. Although she wasn't raised really in an evangelical home, we both went to the same Christian high school. So that was her experience of sort of fundamentalism back in the early 80s, I guess you could say, back in those days. So she came through that system, but luckily for her, she was raised in pretty much a secular home. So she didn't have all the emotional scars that I have. She has other ones, but not like mine. She doesn't have the religious trauma that I have. She didn't luckily grow up in a fundamentalist home.
So, Clint, I've got to ask you this because you have studied the Bible for a long time and you've taught it for a long time, and I'd like to get your take on mythicism. Now, if I can preface this slightly, I've been a mythicist basically all my life. I never really believed that there was any such person, but in the earlier days, I'd have been in the sort of Aaron Ra sort of camp of mythicism, which is there may have been some dude back in the day, but if you had a time machine and you actually went back, you'd never be able to find him because of all the stories and myths that have grown up around that person. You'd never recognise him from the stories we know today. And that used to be my view. And then in more recent times, I've been reading a whole lot of David Fitzgerald, Nailed, and was it Jesus Mything in Action? I've read those, and I've been reading a bit of Richard Carrier as well. And I've pretty much come to the conclusion that this is all myth. And I've mentioned this in a couple of my other podcasts, but do you know about the Raglan Scale?
No, I haven't come across that.
So there's this scale that was devised, I think it was by Lord Raglan, who came up with a list of 22 features that ancient mythical heroes had. Things like their father was a king or a god and so on. And no person that we actually have physical evidence for, or really good evidence for their existence, scores higher than 7 out of 22 on this scale. And that person was Alexander the Great. He scored 7 out of 22 on the scale. Mythical characters all tend to score a lot higher. And the highest scorer is Oedipus. He got 21 out of 22.
It's pretty good.
Jesus and Moses both scored 20 out of 22.
Wow. Not so good.
No. But you're an expert, and I'm a layperson who's read a few books. What do you think?
Well, what's the question? Did Jesus of Nazareth actually exist as portrayed in the Gospels? I mean, that's really the central crux of the whole question, isn't it? Was there an actual historical person? I think there's several different avenues that you've got to look at, because I remember this is one of my famous statements, at least in my mind anyway. My students got sick of hearing me say this, but every time we come up with an interpretive problem to be solved, let's say if we were studying a biblical passage, I would say to them, okay, whatever interpretation or answer you come up with, while it may solve certain problems, it creates other ones. So you have to decide which one you want to use, which interpretation or path you want to go down, because not every interpretation is perfect. It won't solve all your problems. You know what I mean? So in other words, if you say, okay, Jesus of Nazareth existed exactly as the Gospels portray him, he did everything that they say he did, he said everything that he said, and it's exactly all true, historically accurate, blah, 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 blah. But we don't have a lot of external historical evidence. Well, you got some issues. That solves some problems because it preserves the Christian narrative, doesn't it? It's the central narrative. Jesus died on the cross. He rose from the dead for your sins and mine. And that's really the essence of the Christian message. But you then have other problems, like, for example, the fact that the Gospels don't agree with each other. There's contradictions. There are problems between the various accounts historically. And so you go, okay, wait a minute, which one is actually historically true and accurate? How could the authors of the Gospels recall Jesus's long speeches verbatim? You look at John, for example, he's got chapters, 2, 3, 4 chapters where Jesus is giving a sermon, essentially. And I used to remember thinking, how did John know that that's exactly what Jesus said 100% accurately? I mean, they didn't have recording devices. They didn't, somebody wasn't sitting there with a scroll and a quill. Wait, Jesus, slow down a little bit. I gotta get all these words. Wait, and John's writing this maybe decades later. It starts to strain credulity, doesn't it? You go, come on. And then you compare the Gospels to each other, and they don't agree with each other in certain details. So historically, you have to really strain the whole thing to make it work. So that's just one example of the going down that line. Then if you go down the other line and say, no, Jesus never existed as a historical character, it's all mythology, I think you have some problems, though, because the Christian tradition, I still can't get around that. Did they all believe it because it was a lie or that he never existed? I'm not sure where I'm at on that one, but it's, the historical record seems to indicate that maybe there was a person, but like you say, maybe the myths and legends grew up around him. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think probably being not sure is the only correct path. It's a bit like when people ask about the Big Bang. Where did the universe come from? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and I know for sure, well, that you're never going to convince almost any Christian. If you go to the Christian and say, look, I read David Fitzgerald's book. I think it's all mythology. There was never such a person as Jesus of Nazareth. He never existed historically. You can't find any evidence or very, very little evidence outside of the biblical record. You're basing your entire faith on the Gospels, basically, and what Paul then later said. What about that? They're never going to go, oh my God, you're right. I'm not a Christian anymore. I mean, they're going to double down. They're going to argue. So to me, that argument may be true, but to me, it has limited value in terms of apologetics. I don't think you're going to convince any Christian or most Christians that it's true, even if it is true. There's other avenues that you got to go down, I think, to make Christians question maybe the validity of their faith or their belief in God, for example. There's other ways that you have to go about it, I think.
You mentioned extra biblical sources, and one of the ones that are obviously quoted quite often is the Testimonian Flavian.
Josephus, which is then later proved to be a forgery or an insertion into his text.
Eusebius, wasn't it, about 300 or 400 years later? Most people point the finger at.
Yeah, but I can remember as a Christian reading that. I never knew that. I read the book and I read, Josh McDowell, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and he quotes Josephus and says, see, right there. I mean, a Roman historian who was a Jew, no less, he was a turncoat writing for the Roman, the enemy. So he was, of course, an objective source. He would not make any of this up, Well, he didn't write it. Someone else did.
Binge listening to your podcast has interrupted me listening to the audiobook of Bart Ehrman's Forgery and Counterforgery. which is a really long book. So I was glad to get a break in it, to be honest, because it's quite heavy. But the sheer amount of forgeries, and the simple fact of the matter is, you don't know how many there are. People still debate and argue about what's a forgery and what's genuine, and it's incredible just how much of it is forged and then counterforged just so that people can make their own doctrinal points along the way. It's quite amazing, really.
Well, just look at, like you say, the textual insertions. I mean, one of my favorite verses as a Christian was 1 John 5, 7, and 8. There are three who bear witness, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. And I'm like, there it is. There's the Trinity right there in the Bible. And we used to quote that. People say, there's no such thing as a Trinity. Well, later we found out that was an insertion. It was not in the earliest manuscripts. So you have to look at those kind of things and say, well, somebody really wanted it to be true. And so they just slid it into John's gospel, or his 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. You think, okay, what do you do with that? You have to cut that out. And if you're lucky, some of the Bibles that you read will have a little asterisk, and they'll say, this section, this verse is not in the earliest manuscripts, but a lot of them still have it in there. So what do you do?
Yeah, you're from the wrong part of the United States, I guess. You never did any snake handling and that sort of stuff in church.
No, unfortunately, I was never a snake handler. I didn't live in the Appalachians or anything like that.
Yeah, because apparently those verses are pretty well known to be forgeries as well. They've just put on the end of the gospel.
Yeah, and then then you got to look at the textual transmission. That's another whole issue, because again, most Christians will say, and I said it, the Bible was written over a span of 1,600 years by 40 different men, and it was transmitted, it was saved, it was preserved over the centuries, and the text that we have today is basically indistinguishable from those that we, from 100 or not 100, thousands of years ago. That's just absolutely not true. It was edited, it was redacted. There are different manuscript traditions, different places that have different insertions and omissions in them. That's why you need to do textual criticism, because it's not this unbroken, nice, easy stream where everybody just copied the work of one author. It didn't work that way, not at all.
Yeah, I listened to a debate just last week between Bart Ehrman and Daniel Wallace. Mm-hmm. And Bart Ehrman was saying about scribal errors and things like that. So he actually said to the audience, if I gave you all a copy of a gospel right now in English and got you to copy it out word for word, how many of you do you think would make a mistake?
Yeah.
And they would make mistakes copying something like that.
Sure.
And then he was pointing to the fact that the printing press didn't come around till, I'm not quite sure, but about 1100, 1200 when they were able to print things. So up until that time, if you wanted a copy of a document, a scribe wrote you a copy.
A monk somewhere.
And there's a good deal of statistical evidence that as you go back in time from the invention of the printing press going backwards, that the scribes were worse because they weren't trained, they weren't doing it professionally, it was something they were doing part-time probably. And so as you go back, those errors are worse and worse and worse. And that's without the forgeries and the counter-forgeries and all that sort of stuff. That's just making mistakes in copying. So
simple human errors, Yeah.
Daniel Wallace obviously scrubbed all of that under the table, didn't answer any of Bart's questions, and the vastly Christian audience all said that they thought that Wallace had won because when he said things, he was definite about it. Oh, we can definitely tell what the gospel said. And Bart was, I don't know, he doesn't know, and of course Christians don't like that. The not knowing. They wanted somebody who was saying something definite, and so they all went for Wallace as the winner. But having watched it, I was just like face palming whole time that Wallace was speaking.
Well, going back to your point we talked about earlier when you were saying about the Bible colleges making you sign a doctrinal statement to be either a student or a faculty member, look at what the fundamentalists did around the issue of the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, right? The first 5 books of the Bible. back 100 years ago, they made it actually, they said, if you don't believe that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, you're not even a Christian. That was one of the tests for being a Christian, a test for faith. So you can see how they have fought that battle and are still fighting that sort of battle even today. The legacy of fundamentalism is still with us on this issue of the Bible, because they make it a litmus test for faith, really, that Moses wrote the entire Pentateuch. And there's no way that that's true, but they'll still believe it.
So, Clint, on the podcast, I've heard a number of episodes where you're talking about dominion theology and Christian right-wing nationalism and so on. And you've got me pretty scared. You've talked about the Christian homeschooling movement and Rushdoony, all these sorts of things. I was listening to the episode where you had Sam Parry on yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about Trump saying the right things for the evangelicals and saying about religious freedom, and that's the right sort of thing. But I've heard you say on other episodes that once they get any power, there will be no freedom of religion. And I'm starting to get views, and I don't think it's out of the bounds of probability that they might achieve this, given that they're thinking very long term. And a lot of atheists like me think that they're just nuts and basically ignored it while they've grabbed all this power. And I'm starting to worry about a dystopian future, certainly in the United States, and that The Handmaid's Tale could become a reality. Would you like to talk a little about that? Because I know you've done a lot of research in this area.
Well, the more research I do, the more concerned and scared I'm getting too, like you said, because you think about where they've gone and how far they've come, not just since Rushdoony in the 60s, but all through the religious right. You know, they've infiltrated the corridors of power, not just in Washington, D.C., but actually all over the world. Just one example, look at Ralph Drollinger's Capital Ministries, located in, I think he's actually out of California, but he has his main headquarters is in D.C. as well. He leads weekly Bible studies in the Capitol, but he's in some 40-some state capitals as well. And he's also in other state capitals of countries in other parts of the world. That's just one. And then you got the family, the Fellowship Foundation. I mean, if you ever see that series on Netflix, that'll scare you to death. You know, you need to watch The Family. That's what got me started researching all this. So,
going back to Rushdoony, he was one of the precursors to this homeschooling movement, was he not?
You could say that if it wasn't for Rushdoony, you wouldn't have the certainly Christian schools and homeschooling movement like we see it today. He was an absolute tireless advocate of Christian education and withdrawing your kids from state education. That was kind of one of his big platforms. And so he traveled the country back in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. He would speak to churches, pastors, home groups, seminaries, Bible college, anywhere he could get an audience, business leaders, and he would promote his vision of that the problems with America are because of the fact that schools are teaching secular humanism. We need to get our Christian kids out of there. We need to educate them in the ways of God, and the best way to do that is in the home. And that's really the kind of genesis of the far-right homeschooling movement, even though you can find other people in the States that were promoting homeschooling from a more of a secularist point of view back around the same time. What's happened is the Christian right has really taken over that movement, and they tend to dominate. They have an outsized influence, even though there's a lot of kids who are homeschooled for secular reasons even now. But organizations like the HSLDA, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, they have an unbelievable amount of power in that whole movement.
So you've described yourself in a few episodes as being a pawn in the game. And that was when you were under the umbrellas, I guess.
Yeah.
And later on,
umbrellas.
Later on at Bible college and so on. It seems to me that this is almost a game of chess where the Grand Master, if you like, the sort of, there isn't a Magnus Carlsen, shall we say. It's almost like the movement itself is the Magnus Carlsen rather than an individual person. And the individual players just playing their part by homeschooling their kids and voting a certain way and so on.
Yeah, and the work I've done in talking about my feeling like I was a pawn, I think I'm trying to illustrate how it can happen to the normal, average, everyday garden variety evangelical Christian who just wants to do the right thing, who wants to please God and get along with your fellow persons around you and all the rest of it. And there's two examples in my life where I could say, yeah, I was a pawn. One of them was the fact that I was raised, as I was saying before, in the Bill Gothard movement, and he himself was impacted by Rushdoony, the whole biblical patriarchy movement. That was one of Rushdoony's talking points. And then I went to Christian school as a kid, which again was, as you say, part of Rushdoony's agenda. So in two specific ways, Rushdoony touched my life, and I was just doing the right thing. I was voting Republican. I was a Christian. I was an American. It was all one big package. And I didn't see it at all. I was just a loyal foot soldier. And that's how they get people, and they appeal to patriotism and all the rest of it. And that's how it works in many ways.
And I guess at that stage you hadn't even heard of Rushdoony.
No, absolutely not. I never heard the name Rushdoony until I saw the family, started researching Dominion theology, and someone said, well, you're going to want to check out a guy named Rushdoony. And so that's probably a year and a half ago is when I started reading. I read his Institutes of Biblical Law, which is his kind of magnum opus. He was a prolific writer, but that was his kind of big tome that he produced back in 73, I think it was. And so, that's when I started really digging into it deeply.
So I was thinking about the long-term view that you were talking about. Rushdoony, you're saying back in the 50s and 60s. I was looking at, I think he died early in the 2000s, didn't he? But he was doing a lot of this work. Yeah, he was doing a lot of this work back in the 1950s, very much with a view that they'd be where they are now. Since Trump's been in, he's appointed something like 200 Supreme Court judges between all the various states and things like that. Conservative Christians, they've got a really good chance of overturning abortion laws and things like that now because of the judges that he's appointed.
That's the end game.
And this is what Rushdoony was planning back in the 1950s. While, I wasn't actually born back then, but those of us who are more secular and even, I would think, moderate Christians weren't thinking like that at all. But they were looking long term. They weren't worried about it being in their lifetimes. They want a kingdom of God at some stage, and they're prepared to work for it for a long, long time.
Yeah, that's true. Well, Rushdoony he believed in what's called postmillennialism. He was a Calvinist. He was a postmillennialist, which means that we have to work to establish Christ's kingdom on earth. And so that's what they're doing. They're not saying Jesus is going to return and then usher in 1,000-year kingdom, which would be like a premillennial view. They're saying, no, we're part and parcel of this whole thing, establishing the kingdom of God. So as you say, Rushdoony's vision, which was then taken up by many, many other people, was that it would take generation after generation after generation. And that's why homeschooling figures so prominently in his scheme, because what better way to impact the culture than by training up kids in the home, releasing them into society. They will take up leadership positions eventually and then start families of their own and reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. So part of that is this whole quiverful movement. I don't know if you've come across that, but just this idea that Christian families should have as many children as possible. You shouldn't use birth control. You see families of 10, 11, 12 kids, and they are physically looking to populate the planet with Christian kids. So that's part of Rushdoony's vision. So yeah, that was definitely the long game. He knew it was going to take generation after generation of people buying into his vision.
And I guess part of that vision is eventually it would be like the Dark Ages again. We'll have biblical law, stonings in the street, all this sort of stuff, burning people like you and I.
Yeah. Well, and those are the more extreme aspects of Rushdoony's theology. And this is something I had Julie Ingersoll on the show a while ago, and she made the point that she'd written a book on Christian Reconstructionism, and she made the point when I asked her about Rushdoony's beliefs, you stone people for homosexuality and incorrigible teenagers and people who are practicing other religions besides Christianity. And she said you shouldn't focus on the more extreme aspects of Rushdoony's thought. What you need to focus on is how his teachings have influenced other movements and other things going on within Christianity, because those are kind of the hot button. Everyone points to that and says, he was an extremist, which he was. But what's more insidious is his other teachings that have filtered through right into the mainstream evangelical church. People just spout some of the stuff that he wrote about and taught without knowing the connection back to guys like Rushdoony.
So how do we secular people fight against this? I guess one way of doing it is, come November, people have got to go out and vote anyone but Trump. They might not like Biden, but you've got to get Trump out. That's got to be step one.
It's critical. Because, if it wasn't for Trump and his pandering to the evangelical base, you wouldn't see a lot of this going on, at least not as publicly. They've always been there. I mean, you go back to 1979 and even beyond that, the moral majority, the religious right, they've been working at this for decades. But with Trump, it's just ratcheted into a whole nother gear, and it's just taken off because they have removed a lot of the restrictions that the church and state separations from the side that the church can get involved in the state. So if you're a pastor right now and you can talk about politics basically from the pulpit, which is technically illegal under the Johnson Amendment, you're not gonna worry about facing any sort of backlash. You're not going to lose your tax exempt status as a church. You have nothing to fear, even though you're breaking the law. They don't care. There's ways to skirt around it.
So with secular folk like us, we've got to be more aware. We've got to raise awareness. The nuns are a fast-growing portion of society. So the nuns need to be aware and need to maybe vote strategically in order to keep these people out of power, rather than, as we do, we bicker quite a bit. In my conversation with Randolph the other week, I was talking about Steve McRae. I don't know if you've seen any of Steve McRae's tweets, but he's often going on about the correct definition of atheism and who has burden of proof and all this sort of stuff. And my take on that is, let's worry about that when we've got rid of these Dominion theologists. Let's worry about how we define atheism when the extreme right-wing Christians that are in power now, and Paula White preaching the prosperity gospel from the White House and all that. Let's worry about the correct definition of atheism and how much burden of proof we have when we say, well, we're just not buying your claims. Let's worry about that when we've got rid of this problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. While we're bickering, they're laughing all the way to the bank, as it were. They think it's great. If we can be divided internally, then that's not slowing them down one bit. Like you say, there's just a new thing. I saw someone posted on Facebook this morning. Paula White has started another, prayer initiative thing, and it's supposed to be about pulling all these people together to pray against satanic attacks against Donald Trump and trying to bring his presidency down from a spiritual warfare point of view. I mean, she's on staff basically for Trump now. She's got an official position as his faith advisor, and she's on his evangelical advisory board. I mean, these people are advising him on policy right now, and they have been basically since he became president. There's no atheists in that community. It's all a bunch of dominionists and far right Christian nationalists are advising the president right now.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I guess our allies in all of this ought to be the more moderate religious people. Progressive religious people. I know you've got talk coming up with a friend of yours who's a moderate Christian on your on your podcast. Maybe that's already happened and it just hasn't dropped yet, or maybe I just haven't got around to it. But those people seem to me that, they should be our close allies, and rather than demonizing atheists, they should be thinking, actually, on this, we're more in tune with the atheist than we are with these guys over here, because these guys are nutters, and we don't want people stoned in the street, and I've got a friend who's a homosexual, and etc., etc.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, but even in the progressive Christian community, there tends to be a level of infighting as well. So even there, that they're susceptible to the same problem that you just identified. They could be at each other's throats talking about some bizarre, obscure theological point. Meanwhile, Trump's evangelical board is having a meeting right now.
Yeah,
Crazy.
talking about them infighting about points, and I always seem to end up talking about the coronavirus at some stage. But I wish that the theists would all get together, theists of all stripes, not just Christians, get together and decide exactly what the coronavirus is about. Is it is it a satanic attack, or what exactly is it? Is it been foisted on us because we voted yes to marriage equality? Or is it some other thing that God's mad about that sent the coronavirus? What exactly is it? So you guys will fight about that. Come to us with your best one, and then we'll explain to you what it really is.
Yeah. Well, that's another piece of research I did. I wrote an article on Medium a month or so ago talking about Christian responses to the coronavirus, exactly what you just said. I went down the line and put as many quotes as I could find about what Christians are saying about the coronavirus, and there's just an unbelievable spectrum of responses, anywhere from yes, this is God's judgment for homosexuality and abortion, to no, this is not God's judgment. This is actually, he's putting the church on a pause while we're going to have a huge revival at some point, and we're getting ready to see amazing breakout work of God, and on and on and on and on. They can't even get their own story straight.
Yeah. We've got this idiot rugby player down here. You may have heard of him, Israel Folau. He's always... Well, he got sacked from Rugby Australia, basically, for his homophobic tweets. And
Nice.
yeah, we may have stood a better chance in the World Cup if he hadn't been. He's a good player. But first of all, it was the bushfires. The bushfires were sent by God because we voted yes for marriage equality. Now it's the coronavirus. And he never gets off this. I don't know why we give these people airtime. I really don't. It's the same with celebrities on all sorts of things. Celebrity anti-vaxxers and all the rest of it. Why do we give these people airtime? When you're talking about anything, climate change, vaccinations, etc., etc., surely the expert word is worth more than that of a Kardashian.
Doesn't matter. Yeah. But they're still trying to stay relevant. If it gets retweets and likes, then that works, I guess. I mean, it's kind of like Trump in a way, isn't it? He can say any outlandish tweet and statement, and it gets airtime, doesn't it? It gets, can you believe what Trump tweeted today? Oh, my God, the latest outrage. And it dominates the news cycle for the next day or two. So it's the same kind of principle, isn't it? The power of social media is immense today.
Yeah, absolutely. And even though everything is recorded, people deny what was said, even though we've got recordings of it.
I never said that. You said it yesterday. Or I was being sarcastic. That's the other one. Trump's favorite. Yeah. It was a joke. I was joking. It was sarcasm.
Yeah, it's
about injecting bleach in your system. Yeah, it's completely insane. But here's a guy that's a conspiracy theorist and a science denier, and there you have it. And yet people are believing that he's handling the coronavirus and doing a fantastic job because he goes out there every day and says, we're winning. We're not winning. We're losing in America for sure.
But when I organise it by number of cases, USA's always at the top. So surely you are winning. Gold medal place.
Yeah. That's what they said. Trump's always campaigned on an America First platform. Well, this is not the way you want America to be first. And number of cases and number of deaths. That's not a good statistic, is it?
No. And coming back to the Christian right, of course, they don't want taxes and they don't want universal health care. And something like this pandemic has really shown that universal health care is absolutely essential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you look at the countries where, like here in the UK, we have the NHS, and it's got its problems, but we're not worried about paying hundreds of thousands of pounds if we get sick or have a big catastrophic accident. Whereas in America, my God, it's yeah, like you said, it's shown the huge gaping cracks in the system that they've been papering over for years, and they're just absolutely unbelievably glaring now. The whole system is just rotten to the core. It's a shame, really, because people have died needlessly, haven't they? Because they can't get testing, they can't get the health care they need, and that's the result of this system.
Yeah, here in Australia, as soon as this started, and I guess with our separation from the rest of the world, we had a bit of a head start and we could see what was happening
Mm-hmm.
elsewhere. But elective surgeries, for example, they cancelled all elective surgeries
Yeah, same here.
because, yeah, because they wanted the beds free for patients. But at the moment, I believe in Western Australia, and this was true this afternoon, there is only actual one coronavirus patient in hospital in Western Australia, in the whole of Western
Mm.
Australia. So we're doing very, very well here.
Yeah.
And so they are starting some elective surgeries, but they'll pull the plug on that immediately if the cases go up.
Mm-hmm.
So with at least some restrictions, I went out earlier on today.
Yeah.
I needed some new fittings for my shower. My shower hose was leaking, and I went and
Mm-hmm.
got a new part for it. And there was a queue outside the shop, as there is in many shops now. Everybody
Yeah.
was standing 2 meters apart,
Yeah. Same
and
here.
they were letting people out and people in, and nobody was making a fuss about it. A couple
Mm-hmm.
of weeks ago, I was talking to Ebony Skeptic, and she was telling me, I don't think we were actually recording at the time, but I think she told me afterwards that she's got a sister who's one of these dominionist types, and just refuses to stand in that queue and just barges past people and pushes her way into the shop.
Crazy.
And she's in an area where they're supposed to be wearing masks, and she refuses to wear it because
Yep.
God's got my back, and
Yep.
it's just crazy.
It is
And it,
crazy, and like I say, nuts. They're quoting Bible verses, Psalm 91, that God's going to protect you from the pestilence and the plague, and I'm covered by the blood of Jesus and all the rest. I mean, look at these churches that are refusing to close down. You see that guy Tony Spell in Louisiana. He's caused a lot of headlines, hasn't he? Refusing to close his church. He's been arrested. He's been out on bail. He refuses to close his church down, even though he's putting people at risk because they're denying science in favor of faith.
yeah, yeah, it's
Hmm.
crazy.
It is because it shows you not only the levels of indoctrination that he himself believes that the virus is a hoax and you can trumpet in favor of faith, but then his followers are going right along with him. So they're coming to the services. They were applauding when he got released from jail the other week. He tried to run over a protester with a bus allegedly, so he got arrested again. He's been violating these stay-at-home orders and holding church services. So there you have it.
They just don't know what a virus is, do they?
Nope,
And
it's a hoax. That's what Trump says.
and of course, none of them believe in evolution, so they won't
Mm-hmm.
accept that the more people that get infected, the more opportunities there are for the virus to mutate,
Mm-hmm.
and it just makes the
Yeah.
whole problem worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, and what we're seeing is you look at these protests like in Michigan and some of the other states, these far right, white nationalist, Christian right organizations coming out in the state capitol, fully armed, rifles, AR 15s, handguns, occupying the capitol. This is insanity. This is just crazy, but it's happening in America right now. So that goes right along with what you're saying.
So, just to end this cheery little section,
Yeah, it's all good news, isn't it?
is the Handmaid's Tale, is it just fiction, or is it potentially a documentary from the future?
Yeah, it's a vision of a dystopian future. I would say it's not a fiction in many ways, and the reason I can say that is because if you look historically at other times in the past where there has been or an attempted theocratic kingdom on earth, which we can point to historical examples, it has not been a utopia. It has been a horrible dystopia. Look at the Spanish Inquisition. Look at Calvin's Geneva. Look at England under Cromwell. Even the Old Testament was a theocracy before the kings. It was not a good place to live. You could be stoned for being all the things that Rushdoony was advocating. They really happened back then. It didn't sound like it was a good place to live. And so every time there's been an attempt to establish a theocracy in this world, it's been a horrible experiment. It has not been a fun place to live. You don't want to live in Calvin's Geneva.
I've often said that if we could invent a time machine and actually send some of these people back to live in the Dark Ages, just for a couple of months, bring them forward and see if they've got the same view that they used to have. Because I think a good many people, like you say, the pawns in the game, who are, really part of the movement, I wonder how many of them really want to live in that world.
Yeah.
Back when you were growing up under the umbrellas, would you have wanted to live in that world?
Well, I thought I did. And that was the thing, is that we were going to save the world through evangelism, proselytizing people, spreading the gospel, foreign missions. That was the vision that I bought into. That was what I was told growing up. And I never thought of it as establishing a theocracy. But I guess the implication would have been, what would have happened if the world had indeed become Christianized like we were trying to do? We were trying to literally save the world. This is what was driving a lot of the people at the top. And this is something I picked up from Catherine Stewart, who wrote the book, The Power Worshippers, that I think everybody should read. She said that the people at the top have a different sort of storyline or drive than the sort of foot soldiers at the bottom. They see churches, their vision of churches is they're like cells all across America and the world, really. If they can just mobilize those cells and have loyal foot soldiers who are doing their bidding, then that's what they're all about. That's kind of what their agenda is, people at the top, and that's what they're working toward. And so, like, for example, the Family Research Council, Tony Perkins, they have these meetings in churches all across America where they train up pastors to influence their parishioners to vote certain ways for certain candidates, to get politically active, to mobilize their congregation. And so that's what they're hard at work doing. And she said that one of the things that the religious right has done really, really well is they have mobilized that loyal foot soldier at the bottom. And he or she feels like they are part of something bigger than themselves, that their one vote is important and it matters. And she said the progressive side has not done that at all. So we're way behind the eight ball.
One of the things I picked up from one of the podcasts was about the pro-life movement and how that wasn't a big talking point a few years ago, but they, through sort of market research and so on, they found that was going to be a real motivator for the foot soldier, as you say. And the pro-life movement has all grown out of that. It wasn't even a talking point 30, 40 years ago.
And according to what Catherine Stewart has researched, she's found that a lot of the Republicans, even the Southern Baptists at the time when Roe versus Wade was passed in 1973, they were actually a lot more moderate on the subject. Some of them were even more almost pro-life or pro-choice, you could say. But it was through the work of, like you were talking about, guys like Jerry Falwell, the Moral Majority. It all started as a movement to end racial, or to stop the IRS from taking tax exempt status away from racially segregated colleges like Bob Jones University. But they knew that wasn't going to work. So, we can't get people to rally around the flag of, hey, let's keep our segregationist schools, So they picked abortion, and that was their hot topic, and it's worked. It's all about abortion all the time. That's what Catherine Stewart said, and it's true.
This is an out of left field sort of thought, but if you mapped this dystopian future that they want, together with Rawls' veil of ignorance, where you don't know what part you're going to play in that dystopian future, I wonder how many of them would go for that, because you don't know if you're going to be one of the head honchos, or the person who's falsely accused of witchcraft.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the kind of thing that happened in the Inquisition, wasn't it? If you wanted your neighbor's property, you just turned him in for any imagined heresy, in air quotes, and the next thing you know, the Inquisition was dragging him off, and that was the last you saw the guy. He was gone. And next thing you saw, he was being burned at the stake. I mean, look at the recent abortion laws. About, what was it, last year? 7 or 8 states all of a sudden passed or tried to pass some really draconian abortion laws restricting abortions, and they said that if you were a woman and you wanted an abortion in a state where it was illegal, if you traveled across state lines to another state to get an abortion, you could go to prison for that. They were trying to send abortion doctors to prison for performing abortions. So that's how extreme this stuff is, and this was just last year. This is not something out of 1984's vision of a dystopian future. This is happening right now.
Have you seen pictures of Iran before they had the big religious turnover?
Yeah, before the revolution.
Women wearing jeans and t-shirts and stuff like that. And now, if they're not wearing the right thing, they're thrown in jail and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where they're going. It's not going to be different just because they're Christian and the people over there are Muslims. It's going to be the same. It's going to be a patriarchy. It's going to be just horrible.
We're in the Handmaid's Tale. It's Gilead. It won't be exactly like Gilead, but the pieces are there. Like you say, if anytime you look at history and see when Christians were actually in charge, that's what they instituted. It was a Handmaid's Tale type society. That's where you look at places like Geneva and England under Cromwell. They outlawed drinking and gambling and theaters and Christmas, and they cracked down on any sort of vice that they saw. Any sort of heresy was punishable by death. And heresy was defined by them. So that's what's happened historically. So there's no reason that I think it's not going to happen again if they get their way.
I totally agree with you, Clint. Anyway, I've taken up a lot of your time, and I'm extremely grateful for it. Thank you very much for joining me, and maybe we'll talk again in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely. Be great to talk.
Yeah, thank you very much.